anyway, yeah.
Okay.
It's yours.
Okay. Great.
Okay, thanks everyone. It is on.
It is on.
Okay.
Go in the room.
Right, okay. Thanks to our online attendees and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm Kirsten Gerwood-Colvert. I'm research faculty on main campus in the Department of Integrative Biology. And so I'm super happy today to be welcoming Gorka Sancho, who is a friend and colleague who has agreed to spend part of our his sabbatical here with us, and to give a seminar today. So thanks, Gorka, for being here and for your time. So Gorka gave me a little summary, but I wrote this summary. I think he was downplaying himself, so I'm gonna give mine. But if I miss something, Gorka. So Gorka is coming to us from the College of Charleston, where he's been since 2002. He got his bachelor's in biology at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, and his PhD from Woods Hole. So Gorka is a fish guy, and so we have lots of connections around that. That's part of his biology work as an undergrad, and also his PhD from Woods Hole. Before coming to the University of Charleston, he filled multiple leadership roles, including at the Sea Education Association at Woods Hole, with the Hofstra University Marine Lab in Jamaica, and at the AZT Technological and Fisheries Institute in the Basque area of Spain. So lots of interesting things to talk about, I'm sure, from those times. At U of Charleston, he teaches a lot. I think I saw 10 different classes on the list. So that's a lot of teaching, with topics spanning fisheries, tropical marine biology, oceanography, also natural history of Spain, which sounds like a class I would love to take. And even though he's doing all this teaching, he still finds time for research. And I know that's what you're here to share with us today. So his publications range from elasma break bycatch and ecology, and also dynamics of highly migratory species, ecology of spawning aggregations, also some work on Mediterranean plant communities, which sounds super cool, and work on area-based management in the ocean. So that's also how Gorka and I connect, because we're both on the science advisory team for the National Ocean Protection Coalition, along with Jenna Saldenstack, who's sitting in the front row here. And that's a group of organizations that are working on ocean conservation issues here in the US. And so I hope you'll talk a little bit about that too. I look forward to hearing. And thanks again, Gorka, for being here on your sabbatical. Turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And as Kirsten introduced, I come from the College of Charleston, which is mostly an undergraduate teaching institution, even though we also have a graduate program to the master's level. But the work that I'm going to present today is going to be sort of a hodgepodge of my research in recent years. And I first, before I forget at the end, acknowledge everyone that helped me here. And this includes mostly the undergraduate students at College of Charleston, which have played an integral part in a lot of my research program. Lots of graduate students. I come from the biology department of College of Charleston. We have a marine biology degree there. And also some specific collaborators from the geology department and from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, the equivalent of your ODFW department here. And many, many more people that I'll forget to acknowledge. Now, when I teach a course in ocean conservation, I usually tell my students, you're like, oh, what's affecting the oceans these days? What's causing all the problems in the ocean? First one, we can talk about ocean warming. And I'll leave that completely to the physical oceanographers in the room, if there are any, or on Zoom. We also talk about ocean acidification, which I'll leave completely to the chemical oceanographers in the room and how it's affecting the ocean life and all those organisms with calcium carbonate skeletons. Then we talk about human development and cases of direct pollution. When humans, drop something into the ocean, traditionally it was mostly oil. And more recently, a lot of worry has been done on dumping the plastics, oil byproduct, into the ocean. And I'll present some data today on microplastics and how they're affecting fishes in the East Coast at least. And then finally, I want to focus and tell stories a little bit what has been my focus of a lot of my research, which are the impacts of fishing and overfishing. And this is something that affects specifically marine fishes, which has been my passion and my focus. And if someone tells me, oh, Gorka, what do you do? Like, I wear many hats, but truly at heart, I'm a fish biologist by training and by passion. So we'll talk about all these things. I'll first talk a little bit about microplastic ingestion, and this will be a little bit more of the data heavy part of the talk. And then I'll move on to talk about diverse impacts of fishing activities and some examples of how marine protected areas can actually help alleviate the problems with fishing. So I come from Charleston in the southeastern United States, which ecologically is called the Low Country and is characterized by having Spartina grass marshes. There is no topography. I miss hills, I miss mountains, and I get none of them in the Low Country whatsoever. These Spartina marshes are the characteristic coastal habitat in this area. And laser pointer, now it'll work. We call them rivers, but they're not rivers. They're basically high salinity creeks with currents that are mostly tidal, that they move upstream and then downstream on a daily basis, with a lot of meanders. And this is a low energy environment, which has been shown that a lot of microplastics that are coming and released into rivers and oceans get trapped. And the Spartina marshes are considered to be a sink for a lot of the microplastics that we find around. Now, Charleston Harbor is on a marsh, and it's a very characteristic marsh in which it's highly urbanized. It's a city size of Boise, Idaho, more or less, but it's embedded on a marsh, and it's been conquering over the years the marsh environment. Some review paper recently said that, like, oh, there's few papers on microplastics in marshes. And I'm like, where's all our literature? Like, well, you're a city. Like, yes, but we're in the marsh. We're just an urbanized marsh. Lots of marinas, lots of overpasses, College of Charleston located over here, big medical center, and a lot of suburban sprawl all over marshes. Now, there's been a long set of studies of looking at microplastic contamination in Charleston Harbor. This has been mostly thanks to the help of Joe Weinstein from the Citadel and Barbara Breckingham from the Geology Department in the College of Charleston. And one of the things of all the papers coming out of the Charleston Harbor is that we have pretty high elevated concentrations of microplastics in the water, in the sediments, and mostly in any kind of environment you can look. A lot of these research looking at microplastic in the environment are showing extremely high temporal variability. The amount of microplastics that you can find in a beach depends if it's windy or not windy. Tidal influences, monthly variations, interannual variations. So there's a huge temporal variability. There's huge geographic variability, and a lot of the studies now are focused on seeing how microplastics are being transported from one microhabitat to the other. And I will say that almost all the microplastics that we're finding are secondary microplastics. They're basically buckets, garbage bags, lines, etc., that have been degraded. And these are little shivers of plastics that bacteria and UV light have been sort of breaking off. So we will talk about fibers that come mostly from clothing, fragments, which can come from any kind of microplastics, and films, a lot of foams coming mostly from styrofoam, fishing gear, balls, etc. And a new one that's of high concern, which are tire wear particles. Tire wear particles are a little bit of concern because they potentially are more toxic than the microplastics. They're really spongy and really sticky, and a lot of nasty, toxic things that especially can be found in fumes and roads adhere to them, and they eventually end up in the environment. One of the ways they end up in the environment, and specifically in the marshes, is through these overhead passes. Whenever you get one of these highways going over the marsh, there's a constant rain of tire wear particles coming into. And tire wear particles have been around since we invented tires. Chemically, they're a hot mess. They're a mix, some natural rubber from the Amazon, vulcanized artificial things, but they all have the similar characteristics. Now, I'm a fish biologist, and the concern are like, well, are these microplastics affecting the biology of fishes? Are they killing fishes? This is controversial among the fish population people. There's some studies that will say that they're really toxic. They can alter the behavior, change the physiology of fishes. Other people are saying it's no problem. They come in one end and they come out the other end, and they're not really affecting the fish. I'm not a toxicologist, and my lab is more of a field lab, so I don't have the capability of doing the toxicological studies. Some people here at Oregon State are working on it, and in other places of actually, giving small doses of microplastics to fishes in a controlled environment, looking at what the effects. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm going to present some data on how they're affecting fishes. We actually use the methodology that we use has been developed here in Oregon State early on in microplastic studies, or a hodgepodge of techniques, and very hard to compare papers because the techniques used were very different. And Suzanne Brander and Stacy Harper here in Oregon State have sort of standardized which are the proper techniques to be used. The main problem being that in most labs, there's a huge contamination of microplastics of your samples from your clothing, from dust moving through the air. So we followed basically their protocol, collected a whole bunch of fishes, digested their guts basically, and looked at how many microplastics are being ingested by fishes. And we compared many different fishes from the East Coast, from Charleston Harbor, including species that have different trophic and ecological positions. So for example, we have a whole bunch of planktivore fishes that feed up in the plankton in the water column. We have detritivores that feed mostly in the bottom on organic detritus. Diatoms, we have a whole bunch of small benthic omnivores, feed on the bottom and living things, but they take some plant material with them, they'll also digest it. And then we have a whole bunch of high trophic predators, mostly fish that feed on other fishes. And a lot of our findings, this is, for example, a project with undergrads in which we compared two little species of fungulate fishes. This is Fundulus majalis, and it lives exclusively in sandy environments. And this is Fundulus heraclitus, which lives preferentially and almost exclusively where we have the Spartina salt marshes. And the Grice Marine Lab, the equivalent of Hatfield, much smaller, is located here. And these are basically within, like 500 feet from the lab and from each other. But if you collect microplastics in the sandy environments, and in the same environment, you collect fishes there, and the same thing going on for the vegetated parts, well, you find that, as expected, the vegetated habitats have a lot more microplastics. And the fish that occupy those habitats also show higher microplastics. In the case for Fundulus heraclitus, and then for Fundulus majalis that lives in sandy environments, there's less microplastics there, and the fishes have less microplastics. Not earth-shattering, but sort of showing you that the fishes have more or less the amount of microplastics that are found in the environment. Now, we went on and started looking at other fishes in Charleston Harbor, and we had a lot of literature from what kind of microplastics are found in Charleston Harbor. Found here, mostly fibers and a whole bunch of other fragments, tire particles, and foam particles. And then what we found inside all our fishes shows us that fishes tend to select certain type of microplastic, and select is not the right word. They tend to have in their guts certain types of microplastics and less of others. For example, they tend to select fibers and foam particles. Fibers probably not confused with anything. They're just a little bit of everywhere, and they probably get tangled in gill rakers and stomach. And foam, the little round balls, they might be confused with something edible. They probably look like an egg or something like that. It could be. We also find fragments and tire particles. And I will say that we found that 14% of all the fishes we sampled had tire particles in their guts. And this turns out to be the first reported tire particle found inside fishes. Now people are looking a little bit more carefully at it, and they're finding tire particles in other places. And I should also say that 99% of all our fishes, which I think is all our fishes, but 2 had microplastics in their guts. So it's common, the same as in humans, we all eating or drinking microplastics. Now, comparing different species, well, we found differences. And we expressed originally our data like most other papers do, which is the number of microplastics per fish. And we looked at it and we get different data. And in this case, these species over here had more microplastics than this species over here. Problem of this is that we're comparing species of different sizes. Anchovies are small, sea trout are large. And this is basically showing you that bigger fish have more microplastics than smaller fish. It's not telling you anything interesting, that the bigger the individual, the more microplastics you're going to find there. So we started expressing our data, and we've been very big advocates of expressing our data as concentration. How many microplastics per, in our case, gram of fish or kilogram of fish. And when you do that, the picture changes completely. When you express concentration of microplastics per gram of fish, then we get, let's see, there you go, differences, and the differences are completely different. That the planktivores species have more microplastics than the omnivore, the tridivore species, and the top end predators are the ones that have the least amount of microplastics. So it seems like the ones that are exposed directly to microplastics feed in the water column, they're getting the most. The ones that are feeding off the bottom, they get a medium amount. And then the top end predators that probably get most of the microplastics by eating other fishes have the least amount of microplastics. I should say that one thing of the amount of microplastics that we have not analyzed and people are starting to analyze now is how much it takes for food to go through the intestinal tract of an organism. And in that case, organisms that have long intestines, their food particles stay there for a long time. But predators tend to have short intestines and their food particles tend to stay very little. And that's something that affects the amount of microplastics that you find in a fish. So I want to point out that menhaden, Atlantic menhaden, have on average 24 pieces of microplastics per gram of fish. And today, for a few years, this was the highest concentration of microplastics ever described in a species. There's now a Chinese paper looking at some carp in an extremely industrialized river that I think beat us by a few. This is nothing to brag about, but this was something surprising to us. We went to the literature and we're like, whoa, like orders of magnitude more microplastics than everyone. And I should say that it's driven by some extreme high values, individuals that have crazy microplastics. Now, menhaden is a planktivore. They're ram feeding. You can see here a school of menhaden feeding. They open their mouth and they swim through and they just collect all kinds of particles. The gill rakers have a separation of 10 micrometers, which is way small. It's designed to capture diatom algae, and it captures what we call microplastics, can capture all of them. One unique thing of juvenile menhaden is that they specialize on feeding on marine snow. Marine snow is organic particulates that sometimes occur in the water column, and they form like a fluff. That's where they're called snow. In the case of estuaries in the southeast, they're basically decaying and rotting Spartina grass with a whole bunch of bacteria on them, and they're larger particles, and juvenile menhaden that live in estuaries feed on these particles directly. These particles have been shown to basically be huge aggregators of microplastics. They've been hypothesized to be the reason why estuaries have a lot of microplastics in the sediments. There's all this stuff in the water column. As the marine snow goes through the water column, they capture all these microplastics and force them to settle on the bottom. So it makes sense that a fish that specializes in eating this marine snow should have a lot of microplastics in their guts. When we looked at are the small individuals are the ones that have more microplastics, are the big individuals that have more microplastics, et cetera. In the case of Atlantic menhaden, if you compare the weight of the intestines of the fish with the numbers of microplastics, they had a negative correlation, showing you that it's the smaller individuals, the ones that have most microplastics. And these are the ones that focus on marine snow. Now, to follow this up with the help of undergrads, since all undergrads, all they want to do is work with sharks and not menhaden, we looked at microplastics in different sharks. And again, if we plot the average weight of a shark with the average number of microplastics per shark, well, you get a certain relationship. But again, this is telling you that larger sharks have more microplastics than smaller sharks. Look at the weights. The sharks that I'm talking about are sharks that spend time in the estuaries. We're talking about juvenile sharks, sharks that have just been born. We have a lot of shark species that come into estuaries in South Carolina to pup, give birth. The adults usually leave, but then all these sharks will spend a summer feeding like crazy in the estuaries before they leave the estuaries in the fall, winter, and migrate, usually to Florida or Bermuda. Now we're talking about small sharks, but they're complete predators, and a day after being born, they're already feeding on fish or crabs or whatever they feed on. Now, if we express the concentration of microplastics per weight of the sharks, we get this negative correlation. And specifically, the two species that we've seen through dietary studies to feed almost exclusively on menhaden are the two with the highest concentrations of microplastics. So this is a clear case of one of these. If you're feeding on something that is feeding on microplastics, that has lots of microplastics, you will have more microplastics. We hypothesize that if there is one predator in our local estuaries that feeds on menhaden almost exclusively, are brown pelicans. The brown pelicans in the southeast, the way we catch menhaden is we go with a boat and we look for pelicans. And whenever you find pelicans feeding, you get as close as you can to them, you throw a net, and you catch menhaden. And they're a complete indicator wherever the menhaden are. Well, recently a paper was published by the Georgia DNR showing microplastics in different bird species, and voila, brown pelicans have the highest amount of microplastics. Now, who eats most menhaden in the world? Well, it's us humans. Huge menhaden fishery off the East Coast, mostly based out of Maryland and Virginia. And to catch about 200,000 metric tons of menhaden. Had its heydays in the 50s and 80s of the fishery. Now it's stable at about 100,000 tons. And this is a reduction fishery, so the fish get all collected and they get ground up, guts and all, microplastics and all. And in your case, I notice a lot of people around here have chickens. Well, you're feeding your chickens menhaden. Part of the supplement of chicken feed comes from there. And a lot of you that take fish oils for dietary supplement, that's also basically ground up oils from menhaden. What's going on with the microplastics in these products? I definitely have no idea. Right now, it's not controlled, but it's probably significant a little bit, unless they're filtering them at some point. So basically, there's a lot of variability in our research program now. It's expanding away from Charleston Harbor, which is the urbanized environment, to more natural environments where there's a lot less people around. Preliminary data show that there's less microplastics there, which is good, and that the fish have less microplastics. But the variability, temporal and spatially, seems to be tremendous. But with this, I want to move on to a little bit of fisheries, which is my heart at times. Now, fisheries vary tremendously around the world. There's all kinds of fisheries. The economic profit and social impact of fisheries varies tremendously. And this leads to the idea like, can a fishery be economically sustainable, or can a fishery be socially sustainable to the people involved in it? From a biological perspective, the impact of fisheries on target and other species, same thing. Some fisheries are sustainable, some are not sustainable from an environmental perspective. How the fish are caught can have huge environmental impacts on the environment, independently of the fishes, but on other invertebrates and the habitat itself. And one thing that I've worked over the years is that behavior of fishes is greatly altered by different fisheries. Over the years, I've worked on different fisheries, from local coastal fisheries like monkfish in northern Spain to big ocean international fisheries like tropical tuna. And I'll show you a couple examples. one thing to understand, and this is again from a couple of my lectures, is no fisheries are well managed, especially in the United States. But when you manage a fishery, you basically catch so many fish, and you can argue to what level. But no matter how you measure the success or the sustainability of a fishery, a fact is that all our oceans right now are not pristine. There is no fishery that leads to pristine. It's like logging 50% of your trees. Like, you still have a forest, but is that a pristine old growth forest? Like, no, this is juvenile, this is this. We changed the species. We altered the environment. Today's oceans are the same way. Are there fish out there? There's plenty. Are they pristine? No, they've been altered directly by fisheries to a certain level. Being in Newport, I thought it would be a good tell you a little story of a different town where I used to live. When I worked in Spain, I lived in the fishing town of Bermeo in the Basque Country, a little bit smaller than Newport. Gorgeous little town that has been basically focused on fisheries since the 1200s. You can see, if you look at the town of Bermeo, this is their logo. It's got St. John's there. It's got a couple of wolves, and then it's got a whale and a whaling ship. Bermeo is also famous now, very recently, for younger generations. I don't know if you recognize that place, but if you put a couple of dragons there and put a castle on top, and it's Dragonstone from the Game of Thrones. This is the Hermitage of San Juan de Gaztelugatxe, which has all got marine motifs. And whenever a fisherman dies out at sea, there's huge peregrinations to there to have a mass in honor of the dead fisherman. And this has been going on since ever. Now, Bermeo was a fishing town, and like all fisheries, they're based on economy, and the high price of fish, if you want to call it, at the time were whales. Whales was where you got the most bang for your buck in a fishery, and Bermeo was a whaling town for many hundreds of years. But they killed the next to last European right whale in 1898. The last European right whale was killed the following year by a competing town 50 miles over to the west. And since then, there hasn't been any right whales in Europe. You probably heard in the east coast of the United States, there's a remaining population of right whales, and they're down to 300 and something, and declining, and probably will become, maybe in our lifetime, an extinct species. It's being very tough. A lot of things are made to mitigate this, but in the case of Europe, they got hunted down, and you can actually look at the value of it and what they did with it and how much money it gave them. So here you have a fishing town where it suddenly completely lost its way of living. Well, they adapted. Fishermen are smart people, and they adapted, and steam engines became the next industrial thing, and they embraced it, and they developed a whole steam engine fishing fleet. And over the years, well, they went and fished local fishes, and they decreased the demersal and nearshore fish populations to the point where sports fishermen, it's very little to catch out there because it's been fished chronically for the last 100 years. As these fisheries went down, well, they diversified again. Well, let's go pelagically. Let's go to the open ocean and faraway waters, and let's catch tuna, just like here. Big fishery in Bermeo, the main prey were albacore. Not only albacore, they also went out for the anchovies, which is what the albacore fish, because you guys are not aware, but anchovies are delicious. If you avoid salting them and putting in a pizza, if you actually eat them fresh, they're really, really tasty. So there in Bermeo in Spain, you're catching the predator and the prey at the same time. Over time, this obviously decreased the amount of fishes in time. And there's been a decreased amount of fish of albacore and anchovies. They're managed. And are they sustainable? Yes, sort of borderline. Today, if you go to Bermeo and you go to this, you notice it's the same pictures of the same port. Nothing has changed there. Now it's all recreational boats. It's all fishing for fun, not for money. There is a reduced commercial fishing, still fishing for albacore, for anchovies, and they also now fish for mackerel, which Spaniards do not eat, but there's big tuna farms in southern Spain, and they're fed mackerel. So now you'll see all these fishing boats putting them in cooler and big trucks, shipping them into southern Spain and feeding bluefin tuna in the Mediterranean farms. But there's all this now fun recreational fishing activity. Interestingly, if you look, this is a plot of the population size of the town of Bermeo, and you can see how it greatly increased in population during the beginning of the 20th century. And then since 1970, basically, the population size has not changed. This recreational fishery are not like here in Newport. Now we have NOAA, now we got Oregon State, now we got McMansions coming up and tourists that want to come here. Bermeo's never been a tourist town. It doesn't have a beach. It's all rocky shore, et cetera. It's always been a fishing town, but the fishermen now are spending their free time going outside and catching fishes. Where did this come from? Well, it turns out that Bermeo is now sort of the leader in offshore tropical tuna boats. 90% of the Spanish captains, fish masters, and crew in tropical tuna boats come from the town of Bermeo. Why? Because they're the ones that get trained. If you're a good, promising 20-year-old and computer whiz, and your uncle's a fish captain, they take you out, and after a few years, you learn the trade, and next thing you know, you're captaining a tropical tuna boat, which never come to Bermeo. They are down in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the tropical Atlantic Ocean, and they never come back. They're just constantly there. The crews get shipped back and forth. And Spaniard, American tropical tuna boats, you work there for 5 years until you get tired of not seeing your family and you leave the profession. In Spain, they're a lot more sustainable socially. So they have 2 full sets of crews and they work on 3 months. So you go there, you go to the tropics, you work nonstop for 3 months, and then you spend 3 months back at home. And while the other crew is managing the boat. So the boat is always fishing, but you basically double the amount of people and make it a sustainable living. And a lot of these captains have now been fishing tropical tuna for 30, 40 years and are still doing it. I should say that the good captains do the spring and the fall and have free Christmas and summer. And then the young captains work Christmas and summer and have the opposite side. So these are modern fisheries. These, I'm not going to show the video, but the nets that they use are 1 mile long and 400 meters deep. They're meant to go below the thermocline so the tuna cannot escape underneath it. And they can encompass a whole school of tuna. And if there happens to be a whale or something like that, they'll catch it too. They completely avoid it. This is a mess for the net, but they're really, really large. Technologically, I know Oregon State is trying to get a new oceanographical ship and getting delays. The latest technology today going on boat electronics and freezer capabilities, on engine, on speeds, is going because of this fleet. I mean, these boats make top end speeds of 25 knots, and they're like, why? So they can catch up to a big school of yellowfin tuna that's running away. Like, oh, we want to overtake them. So we want speed, and we want to, a lot of freezer technology has been going on in boats, has been developed for these people to freeze them as fast as possible. And electronic wise, I mean, they have a direct line of purchase with Simran and Furuno, and they buy all the latest sonars, satellite data, et cetera. So they're top of the line of boats, and they're being built everywhere. United States boatyards are building many of them. Spain produces many of them. Korea and China are all building these boats. A big concern is that all these boats are just meant to catch tuna, and they're going to be catching tuna for many, many years to come, especially since they're brand new. What do they catch? Well, they do not catch albacore. Albacore is caught mostly by trolling, live bait, long line. Albacore a little bit more subtropical. Find them here. I don't call Newport tropical. They're a little bit here, and they don't form the kind of schools that these purse seiners need to collect and catch. They're catching mostly skipjack tuna, tropical species, small, some lines, and they're the sort of like the cheap cans of tuna that you'll find. And they're caught almost exclusively by purse seine. They catch yellowfin tuna, which is caught with live bait and long line, but it's mostly caught by these purse seiners. They're the better cans of tuna, if you want, of these. And then big-eye tuna. Big-eye tuna is one that's on the verge of being endangered. It's definitely overfished around the world. You catch it by long line, and you'll find it in high-end sushi locations. But you can also catch it by purse seine as a bycatch. People don't want to catch him, but what happens is that a juvenile big eye looks exactly the same as a juvenile yellowfin tuna. And unless you happen to be a trained fisheries biologist, you can't tell them apart. In this case, they end up in the factories, they end up in a can. And this is the reason why every once in a while you love your whatever can of tuna. And every once in a while you get a bad can of tuna. You're like, oh, and this one was no good. It was a big eye. They don't can well. They're delicious, fresh, and sushi, but canning, they're the dark meat, weird one that, wow, I don't know, I'm going to change brands again. They're like, it's just a little bit bycatch that they have. Now, fishing boats, if they find a school of tuna in the open ocean, they'll overtake them and set around them. And that's what they love. But over the years, they discovered that if there's a log or a piece of floating object, tuna aggregate around them. And if you catch them, you can also catch them. Today, about 70% of the total purse-seine catches are caught around floating objects. And in the floating objects, you get a lot of skipjack tuna, but also juvenile yellowfin and juvenile big eye. The open schools of tuna are mostly adult yellowfin. Why of this? Yes, any boat, if they see an open school of yellowfin, they'll set on it. It gets the highest price, but it's a lot easier to go to the floating objects, especially when you make floating objects. There's no longer look for logs, etc. The fishermen quickly realize, like, well, let's make floating objects like crazy. Bamboo in the tropics is easy and it floats. And what do we have laying around? Oh, we always have old netting. Let's put them with netting. They've done a lot of research into what works best and what not. I should say that every single floating object that you put has a buoy telling you what's there. They figured out that the more stuff is drifting behind this floating object, the more tuna it attracts. This, coming from the microplastic world, is a main problem. Entanglements, this all ends up, especially in the Pacific beaches, etc. There's a big push to changing things. So now they're using cotton lines and they're making sort of biodegradable fish aggregating devices. And they're trying to encourage the industry to not use netting, but use other more tolerable. People will tell you that cotton takes a long time to degrade too in the ocean. That could be a problem, etc. We did a lot of studies of characterizing the aggregations of fishes around these floating objects. And I will say the best scuba diving I've done in the world in open ocean, just because you approach a floating object and it's a huge fish community living around it. Tuna is the main point of these. I should say that 97% of the biomass of these floating objects are tuna. So they'll tell you like, oh, this is a very clean fishery. We capture everything. 97% by weight is tuna. But by number, you're killing huge amounts of other species. It just happen to be smaller and they don't weigh as much compared to a big tuna. We did a lot of surveys for tuna. And what happened was, well, you can look at this picture and clearly say, oh, there's a yellowfin tuna. You could measure it. And look at this picture and say, oh, here we got yellowfin tuna, here we have skipjack, and we have some dolphin fish and some yellowtail. Oh, you can identify tuna visually. Problem is that these are cheating pictures. If you ever find yourself diving in a school of tuna like this, run for your life because you're inside a net and you're about to become that. These were some stage pictures inside a net that we went diving, etc. And it got very sketchy because the net started collapsing and you're like, let's get out of here. The best picture that we ever took after 5 years of doing this research of tuna was this one. And if you get lucky, they come close to you and you can take a couple pictures and that's it. You can argue if that's skipjack, probably yellowfin, what size, we don't know. So we could not quantify tuna at all visually. Fishermen can't. Why? Because they have buoys. And these are not any buoys. They're satellite buoys. They can send information to the captain whenever the captain wants. They're recording once every minute. And they have sonars looking down is telling them what depth the fish are, what echo intensity they're getting. And the fishermen got them good enough. They can tell the amount of tuna and the species of tuna that they have. And they get this on a big computer screen. They can target any of the floating objects and figure out what they're having. I should say that these are the buoys that they use, about $5,000 each of the ones. So they're expensive. They're sort of oceanographical kind of gear price. And notice everyone writes their name on them with big font. And this is because you plant floating objects with buoys, but you don't fish your own. If you find someone else's buoy, well, you fish it. You grab the buoy and you put it in the hole so it loses satellite, and you'll see your buoys keep on disappearing. That's because other people are fishing them. And that's okay among the ethos of the fishermen. I thought, like, oh, they're stealing. Like, oh, no, they'll take my buoys. I'll take theirs. But whenever any port you go in the tropics, you'll find a place where everyone, at the end, you unload your fish, and then you grab all the buoys that you stole with someone, and you leave them there, and you grab all the ones that are found there, and sort of like the junkyard of buoys, and they're $5,000 each one. So you want your buoys back, but sort of an honor code of deploying buoys. Good thing about having undergrads, they think that looking at stomach contents and doing detective work of what a fish have done is interesting. It only lasts for a couple of years, and again, I never want to do stomach contents ever again. But you can do this and look at tuna caught around floating objects and come to the conclusion that they do not feed on stuff around the floating object. The aggregating around floating objects is something social among them, but is not related to feeding at all. There's not the purpose. Oh, there'll be more food there. Actually, some studies have shown that this tuna around floating object is slightly thinner than the ones in open free schools. One thing that we did is I love storytelling. So we talked with the captains about storytelling and telling us, what do you know about the tuna? I mean, these are people that make a living out of them, and they have more technology than I will ever have as a scientist, and they're out there half of the year for the life. So convenience that they all come from the same town is that you don't have to go to the boat and while they're working, interview them. You can wait until they get on vacations back to their hometown, have a cafe with them and interview them. So we interview 34 fish masters in the Indian Ocean. That's 75% of the European fleet. So we got pretty good coverage. And added between them, we had 293 man-years of sea time. So a lot of experience by very smart people with all the technology, and we got great information with them. One of the ones that at the time was not known is how many floating objects are out there. We basically act with how many do you have, and different boats had different amount of floating objects. The French have less, the Spaniards tend to like having more, but there's about in the Indian Ocean at any given time about 2,100 floating objects. How long do they last? They last between 1 and 3 months. Why? Because someone picks them up. Either they pick them up or other people pick them up. Some long ones of 6 months. Usually those are floating objects that drift way beyond control. It's just, they drift far away and they're like, oh, we lost that one. We're not gonna ever pick it up. Today, a lot of data has been shown of where these floating objects are. And right now, the tropical oceans are basically completely covered with these commercial tuna floating objects. These are in light gray tracks of them. You can see the whole tropical Indian Ocean and the whole tropical Atlantic Ocean are just covered with them, solidly. Has this affected the distribution of fishes? Absolutely. There used to be some logs that set up, and now it's floating objects everywhere. If we look at the Western Pacific Ocean, which is right now the largest tropical tuna fishery, you can see here that there's floating objects everywhere in the Western Pacific Ocean. And here in these gray lines, these are territorial waters of different countries. The United States has some territorial waters out there. You might not know about them, but here highlighted in red are what is now known as the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument, where there is no fishing allowed. It includes Johnson Atoll, where I did my PhD thesis near Hawaii, and other islands. Notice some of them go all the way out to the territorial waters, but a couple of other parts, there's just a little protected area around the island, but not out to the US territorial waters. And if you look at the track of floating objects, notice that there's almost no floating objects inside the marine protected areas, because the fishing boats cannot go to get there. They're not interested in there, deploying them there. But in the two areas in the US waters that are not protected, you can see that there's plenty of floating objects going around them. There's another national monument of United States waters here, and that is a Marianas Trench Marine National Monument located around in front of the island of Guam. And encompasses a large area. In this case, there's a marine protected area in which fishing is allowed. It's to protect the Marianas Trench, the deepest part of the ocean and the benthic, and you're not allowed to put cables and do stuff, but on top of waters, fishing is allowed. And therefore, you can notice that the fishermen put plenty of drifting objects that go through this protected area in different ways. So people argue sometimes like, oh, does a marine protected area help the tuna? They move around. They're like, well, it gives them areas where there's no floating objects. They're left alone. And because the fishermen, again, they don't want to lose their $5,000 buoys and they don't want to get in trouble. So they plant them in places to avoid these waters. I put this, like people ask me, like, is my canned tuna sustainable? And I had it typed down, but this is being printed and it's going to be online. I took it off, but I will say, yes, if you eat local albacore. Albacore is great canned, it's very sustainable, and it's probably the best one you can eat. And then, but they're expensive. How about the more affordable cans? It's like, well, it's sort of middle ground. Yes, it depends what it is. But the problem is of all these tropical tuna fisheries, it's very hard to know what you're eating. Here's an example of a picture in the Seychelles Islands. This is a tuna factory. If you go there, you'll see that the tuna cans that come out of this factory come in English, come in Arab symbols, come in Chinese symbols. You never know where those cans are going to end up. And this boat is unloading there. This is a freezer boat, and this boat is loading to this freezer boat and might go to Thailand to can the tuna. And this other boat is loading to a different one, might go to Italy, and they might put it with olive oil instead of water. But where are your tuna coming around this world today? It's extremely hard to figure out. There's some push to now sell fad-free tuna that has not been caught around a drifting object, but I have no idea how they can prove that because all these boats are using drifting objects and they're mixing tuna inside their cargo bays, etc. So eat albacore, avoid the other ones. And to finish up, I want to talk a little bit about recreational fishing. And I purposely put, I'm a recreational fisherman. Probably that's what got me to become a fish biologist when I was very young. And wherever I go, I try to go fishing. It's something that we do for fun. I don't make a living out of it. When I go to freshwater, I tend to release everything that I catch. And in saltwater, sometimes I release it, sometimes I keep it for dinner. But today's, especially in the United States, recreational fishermen are becoming a huge power group. They fund Ocean Department of Fishes and Wildlife, they pay taxes, and by numbers, they're really starting to outweigh the social pressure that commercial fishermen have. Commercial fishermen used to have a lot of social power. Recreational fishermen are starting to gather a lot more, especially in the United States and other developed countries. And in the case of marine protected areas, recreational fishermen right now are supporters of protected areas. They see it as a good thing. They see it as, well, they'll stop commercial fishing and we'll be able to allow it to fish in them. We love protected areas, but the main question that a lot of managers of protected areas come is like, do we allow catch and release, which is a very common thing in freshwater. You catch a fish, you fight it, you take a picture, and you let it go, and they swim away. Like, oh, do we allow the recreational fishermen? And we tell them no. Socially and politically, it's a tough circumstance. It's a tough question because I get all this support. And if I tell them, no, you may not catch anything in a protected area, they might be against you. And here, even in Oregon and your state protected areas, you've got some rules vary. Sometimes you can keep them, sometimes you cannot. And it all comes down to what happens when you release a fish. Do they live or do they die? This, unfortunately, catch and release fisheries started with freshwater salmonids, which are very cold water, high oxygen waters. They tend to do great. They have very low mortalities. But once you move into warmer waters, saltier waters, and fishes with different physiologies, it's not so clear. So just to give you an idea, something that we're working now in Charleston, we're looking at the catch and release mortality of blacktip sharks. Blacktip sharks are no good for eating, taste like crap, but they're becoming very common. They come very close to shore and they're fun to catch. And people are starting to catch them from the beaches. And the whole point of catching the fish is literally to take a picture and let it go. So we've done a lot of studies to see what happens to these sharks. We let sports fishermen catch them. We don't do it. They use their tools. They do it whichever way they do it. And as soon as they take their picture, we jump on board very quickly. We take some blood extracts from the tail. And then we put some tags on them, some satellite pop-up tags that will measure a few days what happens to that shark, and then we put an acoustic tag externally, so it doesn't, we're not altering the fish by doing surgery. We just clip it on, and these tags will tell us for a year where the fish are if we have a receiver nearby. An advantage of these coasts of the United States that we're really crowded, and there's a lot of research teams putting acoustic receivers all up and down the coast. So any fish that's swimming up and down the East Coast, we can figure out where it is if it's tagged. And these are sharks, and you can see most of them survived and did wonderful things. Most of them, went up north in the summer and went down to Florida in the winter and moved up and down the coastline without a problem. Still, we had a lot of mortality. And I want to point out that we did a release condition of what's the state of the fish when we release it, and notice that we have mortalities and the ones that swam away poorly, and we also had mortalities and the ones that swam away perfectly well. We had about 20% mortality, which a lot of recreational fishermen see like, ooh, that's high. Like, it's high. 20% mortality, like if the fish gets caught 4 times in a year, probably that fish is going to die. Didn't matter if they were catching them from the beach or from the boat. That was a little problem that people were arguing. Boat people tend to have more money. People from the beach have less money. Like, oh, they're tying them more in the beach. They should use a boat. Like, well, they don't have a boat. It didn't matter. A lot of interesting things where the hook was placed mattered the most. Fish that got tail wrapped almost all died. Tail wrapped, they're dragged backwards. In the case of sharks, they need to intake water through their mouth, and they're dragged. Sharks, basically, they're not breathing for long periods of time. They did not do well, etc. So a lot of interesting data, but 20% is something that came up. More and more of these studies are being done and increasing the database. Like, doesn't the ocean catch and release work? And again, it depends by the species. The shore versus boat, there was no differences. They both got equally stressed. Interesting things that we found is differences between keeping them underwater or bring them up to shore. So we tracked and compared different things. The blood chemistry changed completely between the ones that are left in the water and the ones that were brought on shore in interesting ways that I have no clear explanations. Lactate, for example, which is makes your muscles sore, skyrocket in the ones that were in the water versus the ones that were taken out of the water. While dissolved CO2 changed differently, and the pH in all of them in their blood dropped. So very interesting things that have to do when you pull out a fish out of the water, it stops breathing completely. Their gills collapse and the circulatory system starts to get stopped. And a lot of chemical processes occur sort of in the stagnant blood. While the fish is maintained underwater, it's keep on breathing and things are circulating through blood. So very interesting differences. And now you tell me, should we pull it out of the water, keep it underwater? I'm like, physiologically, I don't know if it matters. Different things occur to them. So a lot more research to be done on this. But eventually coming back to the question of, like, can we allow recreational fishing to fish in these protected areas? And my answer will be depends. Depends what the fish, what you're trying to protect, how your fishermen fishing. And we'll say that locally here, I've been talking with a lot of local fishermen, and they're all up in arms with the catch and release fishery of coho salmon, because they're like, to catch a hatchery fish that we can keep, I have to catch 15 of the wild ones. And they're like, they're not very happy when we let them go. And they're like, well, maybe we should just keep a few and not release so many because we're not sure they're surviving. And they're having a lot of anxiety among the fishermen too, because like everyone, they want to catch more fish. And with that, thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I'll gladly answer any questions you may have. You're in Zoom.
No questions on them.
Perfect.
Not yet, at least. I was wondering if you had a sense of how many of those tags are like lost beyond, like I remember. Like,
So there's a loss to another boat.
oh, I mean,
So
there's, like,
yeah, there's a loss to another boat, and there's a loss completely lost. Certain companies that have more money have tender boats. They go and pick those up. So the ones that leave the fishery and end up in random waters. For certain companies that use more fads, like the Spaniards, they'll have a few tender boats, which is job all this data shared. So they literally go beyond and pick them up. just because it's $5,000. And bad publicity, and they're aware of this. They don't like it showing someone, and then local news showing, oh, tuna fishermen are dumping things in our beaches, and they want the buoy back. So depends. Other fisheries do not have tender boats, and they lose a certain percentage. I'm not exactly sure how many, but they don't like losing them.
Okay. And it has their name on it, right? So
They
it's
have their
like-
name
yeah,
on it. All of them
it's
are
like-
completely named. They use them a lot to figure out where the tuna are. So they're getting data from them constantly. So they're like, oh, look, the buoys are aggregating in this area. There's an eddy. Oh, look, the buoys in that area have a lot of tuna. Let's go that way. So it's not like they're going, of course, they go towards their buoys, but they know they're on the way over. They might disappear. They might not. But they use them to recognize good areas for good catches more than targeting their own buoys.
So there isn't a kind of concern of like the ones that are lost more permanently, they're not like killing.
I mean, they'll drag tuna with them. They'll drag tuna with them, but they're not killing anything other than there is netting involved and there's some tangling. Silky sharks and sea turtles are the two things that tend to, well, the sea turtles love these fats to avoid the sharks. So little juvenile sea turtles are pursued by a shark. They find a fat and they're like, oh, and they jump on them. Literally, I've seen sea turtles like jump on top of them, like, oh, thank God, I'm not eating by these sharks. And you'll have a whole bunch of sharks circling them. But they get tangled, and the sharks also get tangled in the netting, usually trying to get sea turtles. So again, they're trying to move away from using netting, and there's these things, but
Okay.
How long was the process of tagging the black tip sharks at the end? You the pop up in the blood. Did that couple minutes?
we had to have a period of training personnel to get good at it. We were pulling blood and attaching 2 tags on them. Total of 4 minutes. Less than 4 minutes, 3 minutes. The fighting time was 15, 20 minutes to bring the shark, and the fisherman itself, get the hook out, take the picture, was usually about 5 minutes. So we added a little bit to that, and we tried to be as good as possible. The good thing, it was consistent among all our samples. So we did add a little bit of time, but it was very consistent. And we did it underwater and very quickly. Our students got to be very good at doing it.
Is this tuna location technology? Is that something that you don't have any knowledge of being used in the Pacific for salmon or salmonids?
No, not at all, because salmon do not aggregate around floating objects. So the good thing about these is you have an actual object floating around, you put the buoy around it, and it's got a sounder facing down. The tuna are aggregate around this floating object. So it works down. If you put a buoy out there, it doesn't attract the salmon. They'll swim by it, but they don't bring them around the instrument.
One word that I didn't understand. Circumnavigance? What is that?
Not directly underneath, but around it. So they're aggregate around the floating object, but not directly underneath. They are in the general area of the floating object. That's why the nets are so big. They have to go way, way around it.
Thank you.
Back to like the microplastics.
Yeah.
You were doing, like, taking samples out of the fish and the sharks. Was this a tissue sample or was this stomach content?
We digested the whole guts. So we weighed the whole fish and we dissected from the throat all the way to the anus. And then we digested that. We didn't cut it and pull stuff out. We just threw the whole thing into KOH and heated it up and digested all the organic tissue, and what was left were non-digestible stuff.
Okay, so if someone who's like studied microplastics in humans after eating like all this stuff, they'd have to be dead. Yeah.
No, you may not digest a human to see how many microplastic it has. I will say that, there's issues with these techniques. We have an issue that our main sports fishing species is the red drum. They feed on crabs. We have a problem with crustacean carcasses. They don't get digested in KOH, and they're a mess. And I sort of avoided all species that target crabs because we can't count effectively microplastics in them. And when it comes down to like our really nanoplastics and microplastics and nanoplastics, which you have to have a very clean lab to deal with, which I do not have, I think if those become a problem or not, that will come from the medicine. That will come from human issues. If nanoplastics turns out to be embedded in brains and causing behavioral changes, I think that will come from human medicine, and they'll be the ones that to figure it out, just because the amount of funding there is so big. I mean, if it's happening in a fish and measuring the behavior of fish, it's always tough, especially in the lab. Human behavior is a lot easier, and
A question in Spain, is there much of a cod fishery left there, or is it been fairly well fished out?
so Spain never had a cod fishery in Spanish waters. Spaniards were known to go and catch cod in other people's waters, in northern waters. So cod does not come to southern parts. Spaniards used to go Norway, they let them, Iceland, and then mostly Canada, because Canada was more unregulated and it was sort of secret. So Spain does not have any more cod fishing boats. They still buy cod from other countries and salt it, because there's a traditional thing of eating salted cod, which is a way of preserving. But it's gone down quite a bit. Portugal and Spain will still buy cod and salt it. Now you can buy fresh cod. It's air-shipped and much better than salted cod.
Don't have to soak it 12 times.
Exactly. It's an acquired taste. My wife liked salted cod, and I made her try it like 7 times. Like,
Kinda like
no.
Buddha pits.
Oh, she used to be a fisher's observer and got fresh cod. They're like, no, just put that away. Give me the fresh cod.
What I find amazing is that on these hundreds of thousands of bats, they actually have transducers, and it sounds like they're actually sending out data live. So that's basically a huge ocean observing system that's going on there. So I don't know if that's already, if there's collaboration with scientists or
So
code that there's something.
yes and no. So there's a ton of data involved there. They look at their sonograms, but they don't save the data. So there's been some projects of putting huge hard drives into boats and like, could you just record it? When you come back, just give us a hard drive and we'll just process. I'm like, this is unique acoustical data no scientist has. So there's been collaborations with that. And there is actually a couple of these tuna organizations have their scientific wing to it. An old graduate student of mine works for them now. And it's sort of scientists within this industry and financed by the industry. And yes, they have access to the data, but not all the data. I should say they're trying to really clean up their act in the sense that they don't want to be catching whales. They do not want to be killing sea turtles. They're really trying to do that, but they are trying to catch as many tuna as they can. So yeah, the data is shared by some things and others are not. Eventually some become public, and that's where a lot of the data, a lot of people can data dredge a lot of the data that becomes public, but not all of it does.
Do you know which data is actually sent out live via satellite? I think you had satellite.
They are, I was checking one of their buoys, it transmits full acoustical profile every 1 minute. Now you can decide to look at it or not. So you'll go to the screens and a boat can only track its own buoys. It's got the unique code. I'll click on a buoy and instantaneously during the last single minute, it will download the whole acoustic profile, which is a lot of data. And so they are responsible for taking bandwidth of satellites in huge amounts. There's 5 companies making these buoys, 1 American, 1 Spanish, 1 Korean, 1 Japanese, and 1 Chinese. And there's a huge market for them, and they're all competing and being better.
And all this technology taking the fishing industry away. I mean,
Well, yes and no. I mean, but Mayo's doing fine. I mean, they have free time and they're going fishing on their off time. Good for the fishermen working in a tropical purse seiner. It's pretty cushy, far away, etc. But from a fish perspective, my concern, there's going to be a lot of fishing for many years for these tropical tunas, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do because again, all these brand new boats have no function. I mean, they either fish for tuna or they're parked somewhere. And there's been so much investment into these boats that they're going to be fishing for 30 or 40 years.
but will there be fish?
They're going down. I mean, big eye, greatly endangered. Yellowfin tuna are going down, and it's an argument fishery scientists will get, oh, they're overfished, they're not overfished, and skipjack, I call them cockroachy, very well, short lifespan, they breed a lot, we don't know that much about them, there's a lot of information coming up, and they're sustaining the fishery. But they're the cans that you really don't like to eat, and they're like, definitely, we've gone down multiple, albacore is so much better than skipjack when you buy the cans that.
And there's no regulation on big boats.
They're fishing in national waters, which tend to be regulating, and then there's fishing in international waters, which is the majority of it. There's these international organizations that work better or worse, but usually not so much on the sustainability. That's almost self-regulated there.
Thank you.
This has been great. So many good questions. If you want to talk further with Gorka, you'll be here for a little while longer.
12 days, I think. 14 more days.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Great questions. Which my undergrad students will ask questions like this. Thank you. Hopefully it works.
Yeah.
Oh, I noticed a couple of times I banged the microphone. Exactly. I held that.